There are moments you never went looking for, not part of your plans, not arriving at a time you thought you were ready. They just happen. A meeting that feels ordinary at first, a sentence that doesn't seem to mean much, and yet it leaves something behind that lingers longer than you expected. Aquarius, you're used to understanding things, understanding people, understanding situations, even understanding where a connection might lead. But this time, something feels different. It isn't clear. It's hard to name. And strangely, you don't feel the need to walk away. There's a quiet part of you that notices. You might be standing in front of something that doesn't need to be explained right away. Not because it's perfect, but because it feels real. And if you've ever found yourself staying a little longer than usual in a connection like this, then maybe this story begins right there. There are moments that never show up in any plan you've made. They don't belong to anything you once imagined. They aren't something you prepared yourself to receive. Before that, everything felt clear. You knew where you were going. You knew what you were choosing. And because of that, you believed that the important things in life would arrive in ways you could understand. But then, something slips into that clarity, quietly, without announcing itself, without marking a special moment. From the outside, it could look like any ordinary passing scene, a brief conversation, a glance not long enough to mean anything, a presence not trying to impress, and yet it stays. Not in the way you expected. Not intense, not overwhelming. It just doesn't leave the way other things do. Like a very soft echo that returns to your mind in moments you're not even paying attention. Aquarius, you don't usually stop for things like this. You're used to moving forward, with direction, with choices that have been carefully considered. You understand how things work. You understand people. You understand emotions, at least in ways you can name. But this time, something doesn't follow the pattern you know. There isn't enough to analyze, no clear logic to conclude, no solid reason to walk away. And yet, you're still there. Not because you're certain about what this is, but because there's a very quiet part of you, choosing not to move on just yet. Maybe you've tried to explain it, tried to fit it into old patterns. Tried asking yourself, what does this mean? But the answer doesn't come the way you're used to. Instead, there's a feeling, very soft, hard to hold on to, as if you've stepped slightly off your familiar path. But instead of feeling lost, there's a gentle kind of calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from clarity, but the kind that comes when you no longer need everything to be clear. And maybe what makes you pause isn't what's happening on the outside, it's how it feels within you. A rare slowing down, a silence you don't try to fill, a quiet understanding that you don't have to figure everything out right now. And somewhere, in the middle of all that uncertainty, a very simple thought appears, not loud, not final. Yeah, just a soft sentence, one you can only hear when you truly slow down. Maybe I can stay here a little longer. You've come a long way, guided by clarity. Not a simple kind of clarity, but the kind that comes from learning to see deeper than most people do. You observe, you connect the small details, and then you understand. You understand what someone is thinking, even before they say a word. You understand where a situation is heading, from the earliest signs, and sometimes you even understand how a connection will end before it has truly begun. That clarity once protected you. It kept you from going too far, from investing too much in things that weren't certain. It kept you from stepping into places where you had already sensed the ending. But this time, something doesn't follow that familiar path. You can't fully read the signals. You can't piece everything together into a complete picture. It feels like something is missing, something you can't quite name. And what's strange is, it doesn't bother you. Before, you might have walked away. You would have left when things weren't clear enough, when feelings didn't match your logic, when you couldn't tell where you stood. But this time, you stay. Not because you understand more, but because you accept that you don't. There's a very subtle shift, small but enough for you to notice. You're no longer rushing to find an answer. You're not forcing yourself to analyze every detail. You're not jumping to conclusions just to feel safe. Instead, you begin to listen to something else, not your thoughts, not the patterns you've always followed, but your feelings. And a feeling that doesn't need to be right, doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to be real. You start noticing the smallest things, the way time seems to slow down when you're in that moment, the way you don't feel the need to try harder, to be more interesting, the way things unfold without a script, yet somehow not lost. There's no pressure, no sense of having to get it right, just a presence, soft enough for you to realize you're truly here. And maybe, for the first time in a long while, you're not being led by your mind. You allow a quieter part of you to speak, not loudly, not clearly, but enough for you to understand. Not everything meaningful needs to be understood right away. Sometimes, the fact that you're still here is already an answer. And then, when you stop trying to understand everything right away, something else begins to appear. Not an answer, not a new kind of clarity, but a feeling, gentle enough that you no longer feel the need to name it. You begin to realize not every connection needs to be defined from the very beginning. Not everything has to become something in order to exist. Some things are simply happening, not big, not dramatic, not carrying any clear promise, just there. And you are there too, in that same space, at the same time. You slowly get used to this different rhythm. No rush, no need to move faster, no need to know where it's going, just each moment, unfolding in its own quiet way. There are times you wonder, where is this going? But that question no longer carries the same weight. It passes through and settles, like a small wave touching the shore, then fading without leaving a trace. And instead of searching for answers, you begin to notice something else, how you feel when you're in it. A kind of peace you didn't have to create, not the kind that comes from everything being resolved, but the kind that comes when nothing needs to be resolved at all. You're not trying to be more interesting, not trying to say the right thing. You don't feel the need to present a more complete version of yourself. And somehow, that doesn't make you feel like something is missing. If anything, it brings a quiet, unfamiliar sense, as if you're being allowed to return to yourself in the most natural way. There's a closeness that doesn't come from words. No need to explain, no need to prove anything, just a feeling that you don't have to stay guarded. You don't have to keep your distance the way you used to. You don't have to measure every step. You begin to understand. Connection doesn't always come from fully understanding each other. Sometimes it comes from not needing to understand everything and still choosing to stay, still choosing to listen, still choosing to be present. And in that quiet space, something very real begins to take shape. Not a label, not a name, but an experience that doesn't need to be defined to have meaning. An experience you can only feel when you allow yourself to be in it without trying to hold on to it too tightly. And maybe, right here, you begin to understand in a different way. Not through logic, not through what you've learned before, but through the way you are right now, there, unrushed, unproven, just you. In a connection that doesn't have to become something big, and yet still touches a very quiet place within you. And sometimes, the things that reach you the deepest are the ones you never tried to define. And then, something begins to shift, not outside of you, but in the way you respond to what's unfolding. Aquarius, you're not someone who lets go easily. You're used to holding things within your understanding, knowing where you are, knowing what's happening, knowing what the next step should be. That clarity once made you feel safe, like standing on a path already drawn. You could see the destination and you knew you wouldn't get lost. But this time, that path doesn't appear as clearly anymore. No map, no clear signs pointing the way. Just a feeling. Enough for you to keep moving, but not enough to be certain. And instead of turning back the way you might have before, you stay. Well, not because you understand, but because you no longer need to understand right away. You begin to loosen your grip, just a little, not letting go of everything, not losing your awareness, just not holding on as tightly as before. You don't force your feelings to become clear. You don't try to explain every small reaction. You don't rush to name something that is still unfolding. You let it be what it is, slow, unfinished, without a conclusion. And strangely, within that unfinished space, something more real begins to emerge. Not the kind of real that comes from confirmation, but the kind of real when you no longer need confirmation at all. You start to see control isn't always about keeping things stable. Sometimes it's about avoiding uncertainty. And when you pause, even just a little, when you stop trying to control things the way you used to, you begin to touch a very different kind of experience. An experience without your usual layer of protection, where you feel things more clearly, not because they are stronger, but because you're no longer holding them back. There may still be questions. There may still be things you don't fully understand, but they no longer rush you toward answers. They just exist. And you are there too, not trying to fix it, not trying to speed it up, not trying to turn it into something specific, just allowing it to unfold. And in that moment, you begin to understand in a very quiet way. Not everything needs to be certain to have meaning. Sometimes, the only thing you need is to know that it's real, right now, in this moment. And you are inside it, more fully than you ever expected. And then, after you've stayed long enough, without trying to control everything the way you used to, something else begins to reveal itself. Not in the other person, but within you. You start to see yourself in a very different way. Not through what you once believed about who you are, not through the definitions you've relied on to understand yourself, but through how you feel right now. And you begin to realize maybe you were never as distant as you thought. You just learned how to keep your distance, to avoid going too deep into what wasn't certain, to avoid feeling too much, only to pull yourself back again. For a long time, you believed that keeping just enough distance was the best way to protect yourself. And for a while, it worked. It kept you from being swept away. As from losing your direction, from letting emotions carry you into places you couldn't control, but that same distance slowly taught you to stay on the outside, to observe, to understand, but not truly step in, until something gentle enough appears. It doesn't push you to change. It doesn't ask you to open up all at once. It doesn't make you feel like you're losing control. It simply is there, in a way that feels real. And somehow, that very gentleness helps you see maybe you don't need to keep your distance the way you used to. Not because you're fully ready, but because you no longer feel the need to protect yourself in the same way. So you begin to open, not quickly, not all at once, not as a big decision, just little by little, a more honest response, a moment where you don't pull back right away. Yeah, a time when you allow yourself to stay a little longer inside a feeling you once would have avoided. And within those small shifts, you begin to notice a different version of yourself, a version that doesn't need to be perfect, doesn't need to understand everything before feeling it, a version that simply shows up. Because this isn't only about connecting with someone else, it's about returning to yourself, to the parts you once held back, the emotions you kept under control, the quiet moments you passed through without ever stopping. And maybe what matters most here isn't the connection itself, but the way you're beginning to see yourself, softer, a little more real, and closer to who you've always been. And then, in a very quiet place within you, you begin to notice you're no longer asking so many questions. Not because you found the answers, but because the questions themselves don't feel as important as they once did. Where is this going? Will it become something more? Those thoughts may still appear, but they no longer carry urgency. They just pass through. Like a soft thought, That fades as you return to the present moment. You begin to see things differently. A connection doesn't have to last forever to have meaning. A moment doesn't have to become permanent to reach something deep within you. Maybe this will become a bigger story, or maybe it's only a brief chapter in your journey, but this time, you don't feel the need to know in advance, because something more important has already happened. You allowed yourself to feel, not turning away like before, not analyzing until everything loses its natural flow, not rushing to conclusions just to feel safe. You simply stayed present, inside a connection you never planned for, yet one that touches you in a very real way. And maybe what makes it meaningful isn't where it's going, but how it made you pause, slow down, and listen to yourself more clearly. Sometimes, the most real things in life aren't the ones you fully understand, not the ones you can explain with words, but the ones you feel, even when you can't name them yet. The ones that don't rush you forward, don't ask you to find an ending. They simply invite you to stay a little longer, inside a moment that isn't certain, but feels real enough for you to trust it. And maybe, in those moments when you allow yourself to stay, life begins to open in ways you never expected. No need to rush understanding. No need to go too far ahead. It's enough that you are truly here,